Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Russia continues to be the chief country of rebellions and chaos. Their reciprocity in Russia doesn't stop for a moment. The Russian government is working hard to suppress their riots both inside and outside. Russia is boiling like a witch's cauldron. The Russian people continue to set fire to public buildings in cities with the influence of Russian leader Putin. Moral and unrest among the soldiers in the Russian army are at the highest level. Devastating effects of the war have affected people all over Ukraine. Many settlements were damaged in the ongoing conflicts between Russian and Ukrainian army in Ukraine. Due to the migration of those fleeing in the war in Ukraine, many settlements have turned into ghost cities. Almost half of Ukraine's population has left the country. Migration in Ukraine took place mostly for compelling reasons. Women and children were primarily forced to leave Ukraine. The people remaining in Ukraine, on the other hand, never broke their upright stance against the Russian attacks. Even the Russian army targeting of civilians in urban centers in Ukraine was not enough to break the chains of resistance of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, is fighting with the Russian soldiers with all its might so as not to be embarrassed by the support of its people. President of Ukraine Zelensky constantly appeals to his allies to provide his army with the necessary support in their struggle and to retake the areas occupied by the Russian army. In a speech that he called on his Ukrainian allies, Zelensky stated that the date when the war in Ukraine will end is not yet predictable and that the Russian army will become more aggressive in the coming days due to longer the anger of losing. While concluding their statements, Zelensky said that they needed more support from the freedom struggles in Ukraine. Zelensky demanded that the Ukrainian allies take responsibility and push their conditions for assistance a little more. President of Ukraine Zelensky, while complaining the shortcomings of his army. The Russian army is struggling with misery and poverty in Ukraine. Russian leader Putin continues to knit socks for his unplanned and hasty mobilization decision. After the mobilized Russian soldiers reached the Russian barracks in Ukraine, many problems erupted. Russian reservists complained that they could not meet even their most basic needs, such as food and shelter, in the Russian barracks. The misery experienced in the Russian barracks brought along problems such as chaos, rebellion, theft within the army. The atmosphere of peace and security within the Russian army has come to an end. Things took a turn for the worse when Russian reservists joined the army. Russian leader Putin is pointed out as responsible for all these negativities. The Russian leader is not the only person who has a hand in the construction of the uneasy atmosphere in the army, but he stands out as the most influential person. Russian soldiers are involved in many outbursts and disobedience in the barracks. There is a great confusion in the Russian army, and this confusion is tried to be hidden by the Russian authorities. According to the inferences made by the Kremlin military leaders from the translated phone calls made by Russian soldiers serving in the army, Russian soldiers at the front are being challenged by Russian commanders. A phone call by a Russian soldier revealed that this battalion refuses to obey orders from their commanders amid heightened tension between serving soldiers and Kremlin military officers. The news came after intelligence reports suggested Moscow was struggling to provide adequate military leadership to newly mobilized Russian troops. During the interview, the active soldier claimed that most of the equipment supplied to the Kremlin forces was dead and explained the sad state of a number of his vehicles. In a translated phone call with his Russian military wife, he said, "We went out yesterday and only today we are back in the old position," he said. Later, the Russian soldier added to his statement, "Russian colonels have not been coming to us for comment in general for 6 or 7 days in a row, when Russian officers did not obey their orders." When the Russian soldier's wife asked if there was any news about the war in Ukraine would end, the Russian soldier replied, "I don't know, we don't know any news." The Russian soldier ended his conversation with his wife with these words, "We have a senior lieutenant who doesn't know either. He went to find only so that his son would not be mobilized," said. The Russian soldier, in the continuation of his conversation with his wife, emphasized the dysfunctional state of armored military vehicles issued by the Kremlin. He told his Russian soldier wife, "I will tell you more when I get back, but our vehicles are just and everything they advertise is fake. None of that here." He said the vehicles are completely dead. Recordings of one conversation that emerged with the Russian soldier's wife came after UK intelligence reports suggested the Kremlin was struggling to provide adequate military leadership to the 300,000 men ordered by Vladimir Putin to mobilize. The UK Ministry of Defence reported incidents where Russian soldiers referred to their vehicles as aluminium cans, highlighting the weakness of the Kremlin arsenal. Data from the war in Ukraine show that Russia's daily loss of armored vehicles in the conflict rose to over 40 per day during October. Contextually, this is roughly equivalent to the equipment of a battalion. In the face of military supply difficulties, the Kremlin purchased additional stocks of tanks and other infantry vehicles from Belarus. But the continued destruction and capture of Russian vehicles by Ukrainian forces continued at an alarming rate. The Russian Ministry of Defense said the main elements of Russia's military leadership are becoming more and more dysfunctional. The current situation of the Russian army is exacerbated by the lack of skilled Russian junior officers to organize and lead the newly mobilized reservists, the Russian defense minister said. Russian defense officials argued that the weak leadership structure within the Kremlin armed forces likely caused low morale among the fighting troops. The UK Ministry of Defense reported that demoralization in the Russian military was built by the Kremlin's blocking units, which threatened to shoot Russian soldiers if they retreated from the battlefield. The Russian army continues to lose against Ukraine. In the latest development in Ukraine, the Russian general ordered his troops to withdraw from Kherson. The withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson means that the Ukrainian army will expand its dominance over the country's southern line. Russia risks losing all Ukrainian territory gained since 2014. The Russian leader does not seem happy with the withdrawal in Kherson. Although the withdrawal of Russian army from Kherson is considered a good decision for someone, the reality is that in Ukraine Kherson acts as the gateway to the Crimea. So the ruler of Kherson can be the ruler of the Crimea. A former US general said the Ukrainian counteroffensive was slowly advancing towards Crimea. Ben Hodges, the former commander of the US Army Europe, believes that Russia is prepared to lose all the territory it has won since 2014. Hodges added that Russia's logistics system were done at this stage of the war, and this would make its attacks on Ukraine less effective. The former commander said, "I believe that Ukraine will liberate Crimea by the summer. The logistics of the Russians are terrible. The Kerch Bridge, an important part of the logistics network on the Crimean route, has been damaged. The Russians are now trying to improve the route through Mariupol to supply their troops in southern Ukraine." He said they are working. Mr. Hodges, Russia's logistics system were already weak and exhausted before this. Now they are adding about 200,000 troops, which will be just another burden. Logistics is not the only issue hurting Russia's military effort. Low morale was also a source of reported problems during the war. Recent reports claim that Russian forces are now retreating to shoot their own men if they try to withdraw. The Russian army, the smell of cows inside, can be heard from miles away. With this morale, Russian soldiers will not feel the strength to fight in Ukraine any longer. We can witness that the Ukrainian army, taking advantage of this confusion in the Russian army, gained more occupied lands in the coming days. Ukraine continues to play a decisive role in the course of the war. Soon we can see a major change in the Russian army occupied territories across the whole of Ukraine. Thank you for watching us.